Golden Age actresses who were blacklisted for not getting laid with producers. What does it say about an industry when power punished principle, and silence was the cost of survival? These women didn't just say no, they paid for it with their careers, their peace, and sometimes their entire futures. As we revisit these dark truths of Hollywood's golden age, we ask, how many more stories were buried with the careers that never had a chance to begin? Tell us what you think in the comments. Were they brave, naive, or simply ahead of their time? Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Legends of Black Excellence, where history gets its voice back. Maureen O'Hara was more than a fiery redhead and Hollywood icon. She was one of the first major actresses to publicly challenge the predatory behavior of studio power players during Hollywood's so-called Golden Age. Born in Dublin, Ireland, O'Hara rose to prominence through films like The Hunchback of Notre Dame, 1939, How Green Was My Valley, 1941, and Miracle on 34th Street, 1947. But behind the glowing success was a woman who paid a steep price for protecting her dignity. By the age of 25, O'Hara had grown disillusioned with the film industry. In 1945, she shocked the press by revealing that she was seriously considering leaving Hollywood due to the constant stream of unwanted advances from producers and directors. In interviews, she recounted how her refusal sparked retaliation. Executives smeared her reputation with whisper campaigns, calling her frigid and mocking her as lacking feminine allure. One producer even referred to her as a cold piece of marble. The actress stood firm. "I wouldn't throw myself on the casting couch," she once said, even while acknowledging that it cost her roles. O'Hara described how studio bosses punished her for maintaining her self-respect by deliberately excluding her from major productions. Despite these obstacles, she carved out a resilient career, but often with fewer opportunities than she deserved. Her refusal to be exploited made her a target, but it also made her a trailblazer. At a time when few women had the platform, or courage, to speak out, Maureen O'Hara was already resisting the culture of submission. Today, her legacy stands not only as an actress but as a woman who spoke up decades before Hollywood reckoned with its darkest truths. Shirley Temple, beloved child star of the 1930s, brought hope to Depression-era audiences with her curls, dimples, and charm. But behind the sweet persona and box office glory was a shocking moment that exposed the toxic underbelly of Hollywood, even toward children. At just 12 years old, Temple faced one of the industry's most disturbing realities. In 1940, she met with MGM producer Arthur Freed, expecting a standard business meeting. Instead, he unzipped his trousers and exposed himself to the young girl. In her memoirs, Temple recounted how she burst into nervous laughter, a coping mechanism that enraged Freed. Furious at being laughed at, he kicked her out of his office. What followed was a swift and silent punishment. Temple's contract with MGM was not renewed. Though she had been transitioning into more mature roles, her refusal to comply with an industry predator hastened the decline of her acting career. Hollywood, ever unkind to young women who grew up before the cameras, turned its back on Temple. While her fading popularity played a role, her resistance to exploitation undoubtedly played a part in her professional marginalization. Temple later wrote candidly about this and other traumas in her autobiography, revealing how pervasive abuse was even for its biggest child stars. Her story serves as one of the earliest and most horrifying examples of a studio's power imbalance weaponized against someone with no means to fight back. Though she would eventually leave acting and go on to become a respected diplomat, Shirley Temple's Hollywood story is one marred by betrayal. Her experience proves that even the most iconic faces of innocence were never safe in a system designed to prey on the powerless. Joan Collins. Before becoming a TV legend on Dynasty, Joan Collins was a rising film star navigating the treacherous waters of 1950s Hollywood. Young, glamorous, and talented, Collins was the kind of actress producers coveted, but she refused to play the game the way they expected. The most infamous moment came when Collins was offered a chance to star as Cleopatra, a career-defining role. According to her own accounts, the head of 20th Century Fox, Buddy Adler, invited her to his office under the pretense of discussing the part. Once there, he gave her a chilling ultimatum: "You really want this role? All you have to do is be nice to me." Collins understood that being nice meant far more than manners. It was code for compromising her body. Overwhelmed, she fled the office in tears. And just like that, her Cleopatra dream vanished. Years later, Collins recalled how her friend Marilyn Monroe had warned her about the wolves in Hollywood, men who used power to control, demand, and discard. Collins's refusal to submit was a bold act of resistance, especially in an era where few women could afford to say no without consequence. Though she continued to work, Collins firmly believed she was blacklisted from major roles for defying the system. It wasn't until television revived her career decades later that she reclaimed her public stature. Her experience sheds light on how rejection of the casting couch didn't just cost actresses jobs, it cost them entire career trajectories. Joan Collins stood firm, preserved her integrity, and paid the price in silence. Only years later would she share her truth, helping expose a pattern of abuse that robbed countless women of their full artistic potential. Judy Garland was one of MGM's brightest lights, an extraordinary voice wrapped in vulnerability and innocence. But the girl behind Over the Rainbow was suffering through a nightmare off-screen. Beginning as a teenage prodigy, Garland was tightly controlled by the studio, and by its most powerful figure, Louis B. Mayer. Biographers have detailed Mayer's inappropriate behavior toward the young actress. He would praise her singing with one hand on her chest, brushing it off as fatherly affection. Garland was just 16 when some of these encounters occurred. Like many girls in the studio system, she had no recourse. Fear, shame, and contractual bondage kept her silent. Beyond Mayer's advances, Garland endured pill regimens forced by the studio to control her weight and stamina, contributing to lifelong substance struggles. Eventually, as she grew bolder and more vocal, the punishment came swiftly. In 1950, MGM dropped her, blaming her unreliability. But insiders knew it was retaliation. Garland later confronted Mayer about his misconduct, an act of courage that likely sealed her fate in the studio's eyes. Her growing refusal to be manipulated made her a threat, not a treasure. Though not blacklisted in the traditional sense, she was discarded when her compliance ended. She kept performing, but the damage was lasting. A voice that thrilled millions belonged to a woman who had been silenced by those who profited most from her. Judy Garland's story is not just a tale of talent, it is a warning about power, control, and the quiet destruction of a star who dared to push back. Her legacy remains glorious, but the price she paid was tragically high. Rita Hayworth was Columbia Pictures' crowning jewel, the irresistible love goddess of the 1940s. But even she, with all her fame and allure, wasn't immune to the dark politics of Hollywood's power brokers, particularly Harry Cohn, Columbia's tyrannical studio chief. From the beginning, Cohn saw Hayworth not as a talent but as a possession. Early in her career, her then-husband reportedly arranged for a meeting between Hayworth and Cohn on a yacht, an alleged setup for sexual favors. When Hayworth refused, Cohn never forgave the insult. Though she became Columbia's biggest female star, he made her professional life miserable. Cohn routinely punished Hayworth for not submitting to his control. He fined her for insubordination, withheld roles, and exerted disturbing influence over her personal choices. It wasn't enough to exploit her image, he needed submission. When he didn't get it, he wielded his power like a blade, cutting off opportunities, spreading rumors, and stifling her growth. Hayworth once confessed, "Men fell in love with Gilda, but woke up with me." It was a painful truth, Hollywood loved her image, not her will. Her refusal to become another victim of Cohn's casting couch came at the cost of her mental health and ultimately her freedom. The strain led her to flee the industry altogether. She didn't vanish, but her star dimmed long before it should have. Rita Hayworth's story illustrates that even superstardom couldn't protect a woman who stood up to the system. In an era where saying no meant slow erasure, she fought silently for dignity, and lost more than roles in the process. Kim Novak was never just another blonde starlet. With ethereal beauty and a magnetic presence, she quickly rose through the ranks at Columbia Pictures in the 1950s. But her rise came under the oppressive gaze of Harry Cohn, the studio's infamous boss, whose control extended far beyond the screen. Cohn saw Novak as the next Rita Hayworth, and treated her with the same disturbing possessiveness. He changed her name, dictated her image, and expected her to play along with his notorious casting couch system. But Novak resisted. She refused to sleep with Cohn, refused to surrender her identity, and refused to be silenced. Her quiet defiance didn't go unnoticed. When she began dating black entertainer Sammy Davis Jr. in segregated 1957 America, Cohn's anger exploded. He viewed their relationship as both a personal betrayal and a threat to her marketability. In retaliation, he unleashed private investigators and allegedly involved organized crime figures to break them apart. Novak's refusal to bow to Cohn's power came at a price. She lived under constant pressure, with threats to her career and safety hanging in the balance. Though she still managed to star in classics like Vertigo, the emotional toll was steep. By the 1960s, she quietly stepped away from Hollywood. Unlike others, Novak survived, but not untouched. Her resistance marked her as difficult, yet it also marked her as brave. She never played Cohn's game, and for that, she became a rare example of a woman who walked away with her dignity intact, even if it meant sacrificing a longer reign under the spotlight. Ginger Rogers. Known for her elegance and tenacity, Ginger Rogers danced her way into America's heart alongside Fred Astaire. But beyond the glitz of the ballroom, she too faced Hollywood's ugliest reality. At Columbia Pictures in the 1940s, even her Oscar and stardom couldn't protect her from the casting couch predator-in-chief, Harry Cohn. Rogers recounted in her memoir a moment seared into memory, Cohn chasing her around his office desk, making lewd advances. She was married at the time and stood her ground, telling him firmly, "I don't want to discuss this." Then she fled before it escalated. But rejecting Cohn didn't come without consequences. After that encounter, Rogers avoided Columbia altogether. She took on fewer roles with the studio, effectively sidelining herself from one of Hollywood's most influential production houses. It was a silent blacklist of her own making, a choice to stay safe rather than stay powerful. She had enough clout to continue her career elsewhere, but the trauma lingered. What's perhaps most tragic is how quietly this story was kept. Rogers, like many women of her era, was cautious when speaking out, aware that even subtle resistance could be labeled as difficult or ungrateful. Only years later did she publicly confirm what so many suspected, that power in Hollywood came with a predatory price tag. Ginger Rogers never let herself be owned by a studio head. Her legacy endures not just because of her dancing, but because of her quiet refusal to surrender. She walked the tightrope between fame and self-respect, and though it limited her options, she proved a woman could still shine without compromising her soul. Rita Moreno. Before she became the first Latina to win an Academy Award, Rita Moreno faced the brutal underside of Hollywood's golden era, a world where women of color were doubly vulnerable to exploitation. In the early 1950s, Moreno signed with 20th Century Fox, eager to build a serious career. But her journey was nearly derailed before it began. At just 19, Moreno was allegedly propositioned by Buddy Adler, the same studio executive who harassed Joan Collins. As an unknown Puerto Rican actress, Moreno had little leverage, but she refused him. That decision sealed her fate at Fox. Rather than being rewarded for her talent, she was relegated to stereotypical roles, mostly exoticized island girls, and eventually let go just as her career was gaining momentum. The unspoken message was clear: comply or vanish. Moreno's recollections make it evident that her refusal to sleep with powerful men cost her key opportunities in an industry that thrived on silence. For most of the decade, she languished in minor parts, despite her capability and charisma. Only later, with West Side Story in 1961, did she break free from the roles designed to confine her. Moreno's resilience is nothing short of revolutionary. She didn't just survive, she redefined the rules by standing firm when it was riskiest. Her story exposes how systemic abuse in old Hollywood especially punished actresses of color, who had fewer protections and even fewer advocates. Today, Rita Moreno is rightfully celebrated. But her early career is a testament to the quiet strength it took to say no in a system built on coercion. She paid with time, dignity, and opportunity, but emerged as a symbol of courage who never let predators define her legacy. Linda Darnell was once the darling of 20th Century Fox, a luminous brunette with piercing eyes and undeniable star power. But what the public didn't see was the high cost she paid for her refusal to submit to studio mogul Darryl F. Zanuck, one of Hollywood's most powerful and predatory figures. Zanuck, notorious for scheduling daily, casting couch sessions under the guise of office meetings, became increasingly aggressive in his pursuit of Darnell as she matured. When she continued to reject his advances, the retaliation began. Roles she was once promised vanished. Prestige scripts were handed to other actresses. Darnell was systematically demoted from A-list projects to films she despised. In one case, studio memos reportedly showed she was denied a role specifically because she didn't cooperate with Zanuck's demands. By 1943, her career had lost momentum, and worse, she was put on suspension, a soft form of blacklisting used to sideline difficult talent without public scandal. And her crime? She refused to be exploited. The final blow came when she secretly married a studio cameraman, asserting control over her personal life. Zanuck, incensed, cut off all support. Darnell's star status evaporated by the time she was in her mid-20s. Officially, it was blamed on aging or unreliability. In truth, it was punishment for disobedience. Darnell died tragically young, her brilliance dimmed far too soon. But behind her shortened career lies a story of fierce resistance. She made the unthinkable choice in 1940s Hollywood, to preserve her self-worth over her fame. In doing so, she became a quiet martyr of integrity, another name on the long list of women whose refusal to get laid cost them the spotlight they rightfully earned. Tippi Hedren entered Hollywood with elegance and promise, handpicked by Alfred Hitchcock himself to be the next cinematic icon. But behind her poised image and starring role in The Birds, 1963, was a nightmare of manipulation and harassment. Hitchcock, a master of suspense on screen, became a predator behind the scenes. Hedren has openly described how Hitchcock's obsession with her turned sinister. He isolated her on set, made repeated lewd advances, and even tried to force himself on her in his limousine. When she resisted, refusing to become another victim of Hollywood's unspoken casting couch, he vowed revenge. And he followed through. Though still under contract, Hitchcock deliberately refused to cast her in further roles and blocked other studios from hiring her. For over 2 years, Hedren was paid to do nothing, a punishment disguised as professionalism. When her contract finally ended, she was left to rebuild a career without momentum, agency backing, or the roles she had once been promised. Her ordeal wasn't whispered in backrooms. She would later recount every detail with clarity and courage, becoming one of the first major actresses to hold a director of Hitchcock's stature publicly accountable. Though she continued to act, Hedren never regained the trajectory she deserved. But she redefined herself as an advocate, animal rights activist, and voice for women silenced by powerful men. Tippi Hedren didn't just survive the wrath of a scorned genius, she challenged the system that allowed it. Her blacklisting was personal, calculated, and cruel, but her legacy is one of strength, defiance, and the enduring reminder that talent should never be held hostage to abuse. Jean Arthur. Sparkling voice and girl-next-door charm made her a staple of 1930s and 40s Hollywood. But behind her success lay a deep and private war against a studio culture that preyed on women. In particular, Columbia Pictures head Harry Cohn, a man infamous for his casting couch tactics, targeted her relentlessly. Arthur was no ingenue by the time Cohn set his sights on her. She was an established star with backbone, intelligence, and moral clarity. According to biographer Richard Gavan, Arthur confided that Cohn would sneak through a secret studio door to catch actresses alone in the dark hallway behind their dressing rooms. It wasn't flirtation. It was predation. Rather than submit or stay silent, Arthur took an astonishing step. She reportedly brought a gun to the studio for protection. Though she never used it, the fact she felt she needed one speaks volumes. Ultimately, Arthur made a different kind of choice, one equally radical for her time. She walked away. At just 45, still at the peak of her earning power, she retired from film. Hollywood called her reclusive or difficult, but the truth was far more chilling. She refused to sell her body for roles. And she paid the price in opportunity, income, and long-term fame. Arthur would re-emerge for a final film in 1953 but never returned fully. Her exit was her protest, a quiet act of rebellion in a world that demanded submission. Jean Arthur's story isn't just about what she refused to endure, it's about what she lost to preserve her dignity. She remains a symbol of early resistance, a woman who walked away from the dream factory rather than become a product of it. And though her voice faded from the screen, her principles still echo powerfully today. Louise Brooks was one of the most magnetic faces of the silent film era. With her signature black bob and rebellious charm, she became a fashion and film icon in the 1920s. But behind her image was a sharp-witted woman who refused to play by Hollywood's unwritten rules, especially the one requiring women to trade sex for stardom. Brooks didn't just resist the casting couch, she called it out. In articles and interviews decades before #MeToo, she exposed how contracts and screen tests were doled out at drunken studio parties and through private meetings with powerful men. She recalled watching a dancer disappear into a hotel room with a press baron, and then magically land a studio contract days later. Louise would have none of it. She rejected offers, insulted executives who crossed the line, and even walked away from a lucrative Paramount contract when they demanded she compromise her morals. For that, she was labeled difficult, the era's polite term for women who said no. By 1930, Brooks was unofficially blacklisted. Major studios closed their doors, gossip columnists took aim, and the industry moved on. She spent the rest of her career in Europe or in obscure roles far beneath her talents. Her reputation was tarnished for decades, not because of scandal, but because she wouldn't be used. In hindsight, Brooks was a pioneer. She wasn't just a glamorous starlet, she was a whistleblower in a world that silenced women. She paid the price with her career, but earned something rarer, the right to look back without regret. Her voice, once ignored, now echoes as a warning, and a badge of honor, for women who refuse to be pawns in Hollywood's power games. Senta Berger. By the 1960s, Austrian actress Senta Berger had begun making waves in Hollywood. Beautiful, multilingual, and already a star in Europe, she represented a new kind of leading lady, worldly, independent, and unwilling to be controlled. But one horrifying encounter with a former studio mogul changed her trajectory forever. In 1965, Berger met Darryl F. Zanuck, once the all-powerful chief of 20th Century Fox, in his New York hotel suite to discuss potential roles. What she got instead was a grotesque proposition. Wearing a silk robe, Zanuck reportedly exposed himself and told her, absurdly, that if she slept with him, he'd forgive Austria for Nazi atrocities. It wasn't just a violation, it was a humiliation layered with delusion. Berger refused and fled. The aftermath wasn't dramatic, but it was decisive. Disgusted, she left the Hollywood system altogether. She returned to Europe, where she continued her acting career in respected films and television series. But her potential as a crossover Hollywood star, gone. Years later, Berger spoke candidly about the incident, confirming what so many others feared but rarely admitted, that old Hollywood power brokers, even past their prime, still preyed on young talent. Her story didn't make headlines then, but now it serves as yet another case study in how the casting couch culture repelled principled women and rewarded predators. Senta Berger chose her dignity over the dream. Though she never became a household name in the US, her refusal to play the game marked her as part of a quiet resistance. In an industry that too often demanded silence, she walked away, unbroken, unashamed, and unwilling to let anyone rewrite her story. Marilyn Monroe embodied the ultimate paradox of Hollywood, the most desired woman in the world, and one of the most exploited. Behind her platinum hair and breathy voice was a survivor who knew exactly what it took to navigate an industry ruled by lust, secrecy, and powerful men who expected more than just talent. From her earliest days, Monroe spoke bluntly about the casting couch. In private, she described Hollywood as an overcrowded brothel and admitted, with painful candor, that she had been propositioned more times than she could count. Biographer Anthony Summers recounted her saying she had spent a lot of time on my knees, not as confession, but as condemnation of the system. She walked out of meetings when producers made advances. She lost roles because she wouldn't comply. She even warned other actresses, including Joan Collins, about the predators who ran the studios. Monroe paid for her honesty. Though she became a superstar, her rise was slower and harder because she refused to play along in silence. In the press, she was painted as unstable, unreliable, and overly sexual, a caricature drawn by the very men she defied. In reality, she was sharp, self-aware, and remarkably brave. She started her own production company, spoke publicly about abuse, and fought to control her image. Her tragic death at 36 has been endlessly analyzed, but her legacy as one of the few women who dared to name Hollywood's hidden evils is often overlooked. Marilyn Monroe wasn't just a sex symbol. She was a woman who refused to be a pawn, and exposed the cost of doing so. Hollywood's golden age looked glamorous on the outside, but behind the velvet curtains was a nightmare few dared to speak of. Powerful producers demanded more than just talent, they demanded submission. And those who refused? They were blacklisted, erased, or labeled difficult. Today, we expose the hidden stories of 15 fearless actresses who stood their ground, and paid the price. You think you know old Hollywood? Think again. Watch until the end, and prepare to be shocked. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to Legends of Black Excellence, where we uncover the truth, one forgotten legend at a time.